thank you very much for joining us. It is pretty exciting to be doing the first seminar of 2023, which I hope all of you have been managing to adjust to actually writing that down. As you will see on your screens, we want to recognize where we actually are situated as Canada Wildfire. I'm actually not physically in Edmonton right now, and I'm sure many of you are actually at other places across the country where you're in the areas that are covered by other numbered or other named treaties. In fact, many of you are probably in areas which actually have unceded land. And we want to take a very conscious effort to recognize that we are working in an environment that is under a number of different treaties and a number of other different processes, and we don't want to take it for granted that we have access to those spaces and those lands and the obligations that come with us, every one of us who are allies or participants, if you like, in the treaties that exist in Canada and the treaties that will evolve. So our topic for the day is basically the updated strategic plan. And when we were talking about what kind of a catchy title, I sort of off the cuff said to infinity and beyond, and perhaps that's overly ambitious. But at the same time, I think with Buzz Lightyear as our guide, perhaps we can have a very interesting, I hope it's an interesting discussion and presentation to you about how Canada got to where we are right now and where we think we might be going in the future. Basically, what we want to do is walk through with you a little bit on a number of different things. Certainly want to talk about sort of where we came from and how Canada Wildfire came to be. And then want to walk through really what we've done in terms of the process for the 2020 review of the strategic plan and cover some of the key points that are available or that sort of came out of that whole process. And we do, part of that is going to be looking at some of the ideas of using outcomes as a way of doing our planning and also providing a system or a mechanism for doing measurements of what we're achieving, how we're making progress. We'll have a chance to talk about science rules and linkages, a little bit about where we see our goals and objectives, and then briefly at the end, we'll cover a little bit of governance and how we sort of operate on a routine basis and where we see ourselves going in the future. I'm particularly pleased today that Bruce Mayer was able to join us to cover some of the history and the context, because he has been an active participant in the scheming, the planning, the workings of Canada Wildfire when it was really just an idea, all the way to realizing it into its sort of current form, which he was actively engaged in until he retired from the provincial government as the deputy minister last spring, I guess, just about exactly a year ago. So without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to Bruce, and he's going to walk through a little bit of the history for us.
Perfect. Thanks very much there, Brian. So as it goes on the slide, so the section started in 2006. And I think the real reason behind that was the budgets with the various jurisdictions. You know, everybody faces different budget crunches each year. BC had just had Kelowna in 2003. 2006, the Canadian Wildland Fire strategy was just being released, so we'd been working on that for a number of years, and a big focus in that, of course, was prevention, fire smart, and then fire research, you know, answering some of those questions about what that changing environment may be. The first MOU was signed in 2009. I just go back, I guess, a bit. 2006, the first discussions were with University of Alberta. It was John Spence. He was the chair of the forestry group at the time. Gordon Miller, the Canadian Forest Service, was the Director General, and myself. It took us a while to kind of ratify everything, get the MOU in place. And it was signed in 2009. What we were calling the Western Partnership for Canadian Wildland Fire Science. We wanted it to be bigger than Alberta. We weren't sure that we could call it Canadian at that time because it was just a small group of folks. From an Alberta perspective, we had at the time we had a partnership with NSERC at the time, which is now ST Innovation. An operational wildfire perspective. They helped us with, ATV fires, hard hats, the type of work boots to have, safety zones, how to deal with crane. That was more the operational piece. We needed the broader academic piece on fire behavior, weather, some of the other things to learn from. So when the Western Partnership was signed, the MOU in 2009, that's essentially when the heavy lifting started, and that wasn't me. I'll be honest. It was people like Cordy Teamstra in my shop. It was Sarah Gooding at U of A, and an individual by the name of Jim Gould, who was from Australia, and he came up to work with the Canadian Forest Service in 2009 for a year on a secondment or international appointment, I guess they called it at that point. And part of his research was to take a look at, wildland fire science in Canada itself. Fire seasons, I'll hit quickly. 2011, we had Slave Lake. 2015 was Western Canada again. 2016, Fort McMurray. 2017-18, BC. 2019, Alberta. And 2020, it was pretty well anywhere west of Ontario, save a little bit of Alberta. So the environment was changing. We were getting longer fire seasons, more severe fire seasons. The federal government, through Canadian Forest Service, and Mike Norton led, and Stacey Sankey led the building of the blueprint for wildland fire science in Canada. Published that in 2019, and that led to a bigger network with NSERC, tied with Canada Wildfire. And so, the recognition that each jurisdiction can't go alone, whether it's fighting fire or whether it's doing any of the research, and having partnerships, strategic alliances help move the ball down the field to help us all achieve what goals we needed. So I think I'll stop there, Brian. Just a quick overview of where we were and how we got to this place. It's kind of an exciting future with the NSERC Networ and Canada Wildfire and the new strategic plan. So thanks.
Super. Thank you very much, Bruce. And I just want to sort of add a little bit to Bruce's comments, because I think it's worth noting that the fact that we had a few individuals who were sort of able to shepherd it through sort of from the beginning through a good number of years created a level of consistency. And Bruce has been a consistent, strong supporter and champion for the whole idea. And so that role has been, I think, absolutely vital to making Canada Wildfire, setting Canada Wildfire up to make some of the advances that we've been able to realize. What I wanted to do next was to talk a little bit about, before my slides are advancing too quickly, now they don't want to go. Here we go. I want to talk a little bit about how Canada Wildfire has sort of evolved, specifically from the perspective of strategic reviews. From the early days, so basically within a year after the initial MOU was signed, there was a strategic plan that was developed from 2010 to 2015. And what ended up falling out of that is that there was a strong need to put in place things that would allow a large community that was able to educate fire scientists, a program that was able to train people, as well as to actually to address some of the key questions that were emerging in terms of fire science. And so during that time period of the first strategic plan, that's when Mike Flannigan joined the U of A and basically took a substantial lead role in terms of coordinating things moving forward. But at the end of 2015, then there was the need to do a review process. And so at that point, the decision was taken that that it would really be valuable if we had some external eyes that sort of came into Canada Wildfire and said, okay, what do we need? What's going well? What can we make for recommendations? And so the committee was formed to oversee that particular review that engaged a handful of people that were not regularly involved with Canada Wildfire, and some of them who played slightly different roles in fire. So it brought an interesting perspective to the whole thing. And one of the things that was recognized in that process, and then was reflected to a large degree in the updated strategic plan from 2016 to 21, was that there was had been good progress. We'd had a good number of graduate students that had been engaged and had graduated. We were producing some very interesting papers, and there was some ongoing research that showed great promise. But was realized is that we got that part going, and there probably needed to be increased focus on building partnerships, essentially expanding the network, as Bruce mentioned, as well as putting a little bit more effort as where we could into making sure that knowledge was being exchanged consistently and to the right people, so that the right questions were coming to the researchers on a consistent basis, the right operational context was coming to the research teams, and conversely, that the products that the researchers were producing was being delivered to the operational teams and the fire management teams in a mode that was sort of communicated well and was sort of ready for use by them, rather than being fairly a little bit less abstract. So in 2022, when we were sort of due to do another review, there was a couple things sort of conspired. I guess one of the ones is that we chose to work in a much more internal way, that we were relying on the members and sort of the people who had been engaged, many of them for many years, with Canada Wildfire. And so what we ultimately ended up doing was working with primarily with the executive committee, as well as with the management committee, who basically oversee the operation of Canada Wildfire. And so what we were looking for is a couple things that we thought were important. One is that in the 2016 to 2021 strategic plan, there were some indications or some indicators that were suggested that we would be able to evaluate how much progress had we made in the previous 5 years. And we looked at those and thought that's actually a really important thing to actually flesh out and build on and come up with a probably a little bit more formal or a little bit more structured to that evaluation. We also wanted to set up the strategic plan in such a way that the processes and the things that we were putting in there would be more enduring and would adapt to what we had seen in certainly the previous 10 years, rather dramatic changes in the fire world in Canada, and particularly in Western Canada. So we wanted to have fairly limited prescription. We didn't want to have, for example, an explicit way of how a management structure was going to be in the strategic plan, but more on how we were going to actually set goals and how we were going to evaluate if we were meeting them. And there was another little fly in the ointment. The 2020 start of the pandemic certainly restricted what was appropriate for us to meet. So we were unable to meet in person, for example. And so we initially thought, well, maybe we can just delay it for a few months. Maybe in a few months we'll be able to proceed and get together. And of course, these kinds of things always are much more effective if you can gather in one room and really sort of hash it out day after a couple of days and over a few meals. It just makes a way more efficient and actually a very pleasant process in a lot of ways. In the final analysis, we ended up having to do all those consultations via Zoom, which is a way to do it, but it's certainly not as effective as being together. And so we started off with a relatively small group with the executive team, which is basically the senior oversight of the organization. And then after we had a little bit of the legwork done there, then we gathered in the rest of the management committee, and you'll sort of know who those are, talk about that a little bit later. But the key point was we started fairly small and then grouped out to the group that was actually key to the operation. So what we wanted to do, the place where we started is we needed to define clearly what the philosophy of Canada Wildfire was. What was the vision? Is where we wanted to start off, and we worked with a definition that basically said we're looking at a vision as being the dream world. What would the world look like? What would the situation be like if everything went according to plan? If everything we did worked perfectly, how would we be able to change the world? And then we used as a definition for mission the kinds of things that we were going to do that would help us to move towards that vision, that we would do that would help the activities, the resources, the kinds of things that would help us actually move forward in that particular to that particular goal, that particular utopia, if you like. And then we also needed to talk about the kinds of guidelines that we needed in terms of visions, the values and principles that we needed to make sure we were on track, and that we were doing the things that we really thought were important, doing that, and that reflect the kinds of things that were important to our member agencies, so that we knew exactly what we were doing, and also to be very careful that there were things we could avoid as well. It always defines both the positive and negative space. So in the end, the vision that we came up with is not that different from what had been drafted in the previous two strategic plans. And what we were looking for there was, what do we need to change? What do we need to sort of clarify a little bit? And so we basically came up with a message that said Canada Wildfire transforms vegetation fire management. And we're going to do that through partnerships that are going to be between knowledge holders. And when we think of knowledge holders, we're thinking in the broadest sense, lived experience, cultural experience, researchers, people who are doing very structured, rigid scientific research, practitioners, include managers in that for sure, and policymakers who have to make some of those decisions on the whole thing. And the other choice that we made fairly probably about midway through the process is that we would use the word vegetation fire rather than wildfire to be slightly broader. It avoids a bit of ambiguity in some ways, but also introduces a new term, and a term that is emerging in a number of places in the wildfire literature, in the literature about wildland fire and forest fires. We also are aware that vegetation fire isn't limited to the forest, and we're certainly seeing the need to be aware or linked into what goes on in terms of prairies or grassland areas. And I think we probably need to be aware, and we will see a growing need to be aware of what would happen, for example, in tundra. The mission that we stated, or that basically refined, was that the partnership would drive innovation in vegetation fire management, policy, and practices. And we do that through strategic investments in research and knowledge exchange, and as part of that process, while educating and mentoring generations of scientists and practitioners. And so again, this is not very different from what had been in the original document, and there's a few things that we thought maybe we could improve on a little bit with the language, and hopefully this is basically is fairly clear on that we're trying to drive innovation, we're trying to invest strategically, and by doing that, we're going to see research, we're going to see that exchange of knowledge, the consistent exchange of ideas and questions and results. And as part of that, we're going to be able to educate and mentor new generations of scientists and practitioners. When it came down to doing values, again, some of these you could argue are motherhood kinds of statements, or things that are fairly obvious, but there's still value in actually writing them down and articulating them. And so this is the list of values that we identified as being absolutely critical. And one of the things I want to go back to that I think is worth emphasizing is every time from the formation of the Western Partnership for Wildfire Science to changing the name to the Canadian Partnership for Wildland Fire Science, partnership has been absolutely core to the thinking on all of these processes. And even though we tend to use the word Canada Wildfire, shortening the thing down to a more manageable size, absolutely vital to all the thinking that we have is that it's going to be done in a collaborative kind of environment, that we're going to be working with agencies who have to make sure that they're able to align their work internal to their agencies, but also in cooperation and between their partners. We think those connections are absolutely critical to making an effective organization. Clearly, we have to be an organization that adapts because the world has changed rather rapidly over the next 10 years, and all projections are that that rate of change is not going to change an awful lot, which is going to require flexibility, and also it's going to expect that we work in science to come up with innovation, things that are new and creative, or applying other ideas in new and creative ways is perhaps another way. And the last two pieces, maybe we have refined a little bit, but we really want to make sure that there's an exchange that's consistently happening between the research and knowledge application communities. And it makes science more useful, and it also makes science more focused on key priorities. And then the last thing that we've put in more intentionally than in previous years was that we would be very, very careful and be very explicit about our interest in being inclusive. And a big part of that is to honor Indigenous perspectives, experiences, as noted here, because a lot of times those perspectives have not only been ignored by our community for sure, and the broader society at large, but in many times very actively repressed. And we wanted to be sure to fight against that. And the other thing that's extremely important is that we want to value and in some ways it says the same thing from perhaps a slightly different perspective, that we want to value the perspectives that come from the science in an academic world. We want to make sure that the experiences people have gathered through their years of work in an area and the years that have been gathered by communities and cultures are included in our considerations. So what we ended up doing, and what we chose to do, was to use an outcomes-driven approach in which we're trying to talk about not things that we do, not papers we produce, not models that we generate, but actual changes that result in terms of the way organizations operate, in terms of the way people or organizations think about things. And of course, then that should be showing up in the kinds of practices and the kinds of activities that they pursue and that they prioritize. And part of that really tied in with the whole idea that what we wanted to do was set up objectives that were durable, that would survive changes in the world, or that were phrased in such a way that we could adapt them, apply them to new needs as we see them emerging and new approaches. And all this, just to get a bit of context, is that we wanted to be sure that we were taking what we had in terms of inputs, the kind of resources we had, the kinds of people that worked for us, the kind of data sets that we had access to, the kind of partnerships that we could form, and that we would do things. We would actually pursue particular research projects, perhaps pursue educational opportunities, and to produce things that would help change the way people thought, the way people acted. So that might, in terms of outputs, the things we might be thinking of might be computer models. It might be papers. In fact, it probably will be papers. It'll be presentations. It'll be training courses. It'll be actual, mentorship sorts of programs. And the way we developed that whole thing was to try and take what we had set as a vision and working with a mission as the foundation and say, if we're starting here, what's the logical way we can link the individual steps that we do? How do we say, if we have this, then we can do this? Or if you flip it around, if we want this, what do we need to have to support it? And so we built that up into a series of linkages that initially ended up being a little bit confusing. And I'd say that we ended up with connections from here to there, and we realized that in fact, it's hard to separate any individual kinds of stream or any kind of idea and be totally correct. But what we ultimately needed to do is to split it up into a way that we could manage it, recognizing that in fact we had an incredibly complex and hard to follow linkage between the various themes. And so this is the table that we basically arrived at, starting with the mission that we had set out, that we would drive innovation in vegetation management. And we would do it basically under 3 columns or 3 themes. And the first, of course, as I've sort of said already, is the whole idea of partnerships. It's absolutely vital that a lot of this work be done in collaboration with others, with various organizations, various roles, if you like, but also of various disciplines within those roles. One of the themes that has come up in the Wildland Fire information strategy, that came up in the blueprint, and that's come up in an awful lot of work over the last number of years is that it's really a whole of society thing. And so we see it as very much, you can't just work with one agency or one particular group. You have to engage many others. And a critical part of that is making sure that knowledge is being exchanged, that information is flowing back and forth, that we're taking things that are discovered, passing it to people and say, does this actually have any meaning in your work? And people who are doing that work are saying, you know, we don't understand why this happens. Can you help us make sense of that? And including in that the broadest sort of sense. A big way to do that is, of course, through education and mentoring. How do we make sure that we are actually training people up both in the actual science and the actual knowledge, the actual skills, but also in the process of acquiring and sharing those skills. And of course, that ties into the whole idea. How do we answer the questions? What kind of research are we doing? So what we try to do is basically put it into these columns that says, if we do this in the sort of the short term, and I'll go through partnerships by itself in a minute here, but basically, how do we do this in the short term that's going to allow us to meet these longer and longer and broader objectives that we're setting up for the big picture? So if we go just through partnerships, this is a way that we sort of split it down into individual activities, setting in a number of different things that we saw was really important. First of all, was to be very intentional, to plan how we would actually create that communication between organizations, academic, operational, between disciplines within the academic communities, between basically a number of different players in the game, some of which, of course, will be policy people as well. And then we are engaging as many sectors, as many disciplines, if you like, so that we can extend Canada Wildfire's reach and engagement to make sure that we're capturing the key information. And a lot of that is built around making sure that there are respectful relationships and that we actually have guidelines that we're going to work from, terms of reference, if you like, that align with our principles and our values. And so the short-term outcomes that we identified, we had 4 of them that we thought were really critical and foundational that we had to get in place so that we can move on to sort of some of the longer and perhaps more ambitious kinds of outcomes. And I listed the 4 there. I'll talk a little bit about the first 2 in a minute here, but the idea being that if we can have respect, then we can move on to the kinds of things where we start to have a shared understanding of the partners' distinct priorities, but also understanding the common areas as well. And that will build ultimately the kinds of medium-term outcomes that we're looking at in terms of strong commitment to the partnership. And then in the long term, we actually are seeing significant resources that are contributed and invested in developing trainees, for example, or significant research investments to support the development of fire science that we need. And what we've done now is to sort of break it down into say, okay, here's a couple outcomes that we want to realize. How do we evaluate whether we're doing it? And so basically, this is a subset of a larger table, but basically, if we want to have mutual respect between partners, what's going to be a measure of that? And perhaps it is self-evident, but basically the partners and the members are going to feel respected or are going to actually feel respect for each other. And the way we're proposing to evaluate that is we'll simply ask questions to say, do you and your organization respect partners? Do you perceive that you're respected? There are also other measures that can become a little bit more objective. If we genuinely are going to value all forms of wisdom and that they're recognized and valued in our research and decisions, then our project teams, the measurement can be that our project team should actually be representative. We actually have participants from a variety of different communities. And then we can count, do we actually have project teams? Are the bulk of our project teams with full representation? We haven't set sort of what are threshold values for that, but is it 50%? Is it 75%? First, we have to figure out what we're actually doing right now and how we can move forward to realistic goals, because it's not always going to be appropriate to have every single possible agency represented. But on most of them, I think we can have a much broader representation than we've done historically. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Flannigan, who's our science director, to talk a little bit about some of the science roles. And turn it over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Brian. Good day, everyone. And if you can advance the slide, please. So, yeah, this is going to be a high-level overview. And we don't have enough time to get into some of the details. I am going to talk a bit about knowledge translation, mobilization through seminars, publications, discussions, conferences, workshops, mentoring, short courses. Some of you may be aware of Fuels Friday that was held last February. It was definitely February, or it was 2 years ago. We're holding a Flare Up February, which is going to have 4 webinars on fire and climate and how it's used in fire management, and just kind of a primer. What is climate? What is weather? What is climate change? Next slide, please. And I think we'll see some of the knowledge translation, mobilization, and YouTube. Yeah, this is being recorded and posted, and take a look at our page and subscribe. We've got all the webinars on there, or almost all the webinars. There's Instagram, there's Twitter, there's newsletters, there's Ember. Check out our website. Lots of things on there. We're podcasts. Amy Christensen, Good Fire. Check it out. It's a great podcast. So we are very active. We're becoming more active with the help of Sandra Kanish and all the work that she's done, as well as Renee and Karen and all the work they do to help communicate some of the science and findings. In the newsletter, we try and get all our graduate students to write a short plain language piece about their research. I find that is a very effective way to help communicate. Next slide, please. So we try and use multidisciplinary approaches. A lot of the research done to date is very much physical science based. There's health research that's been done, led by BC, but in partnership with Alberta. Economics, U of A has done a number of studies on fire economics. The social science, we need to have some more social science, but we hope to expand. And there's a lovely picture from 2016 on your right, and there's Cordy Teamstra and someone else looking at burn holes in the tarp at Fort McMurray fire. See the ember rain. So there's lots going on. We'll get into just a few of the details. All right, next slide, please. So, I like the line, practice informs science. Okay, and that's kind of like where the partnership started. How can we do research and science to help fire management in Canada, and so knowing the priorities and needs of fire management agencies, and then doing the research to meet that needs is always underpin the work that we do. So, the joint cooperative projects, this is something that I cannot stress enough. The problems, the issues that fire management agencies across Canada, many of them are common. And instead of each agency doing their own thing, in Canada, there's 13, 14 different fire management agencies, because the landowner is responsible for fire management, 10 provinces, I know there's 3 territories, but to my knowledge, none of it does not do fire management. Parks Canada does fire management, and D&D does a bit as well. We have common problems, common issues. We should pool our resources to work on these together. And we're seeing that, but we still have a long way to go to be across Canada. Right now, we do have partnerships among our members, but we can see more of that. So, we do have routine discussions on science and other things as well. And a lot of it's been opportunistic, and some of these are driven by things like Slave Lake Fire, Fort McMurray Fire, the fire seasons in 2017, 2018, 2021 in British Columbia. But, these are opportunities, and we take them to advance science, knowledge transfer, training, mentoring, etc. Next slide, please. So, NSERC, Canada Wildfire Strategic Research Network, it's a mouthful. Emergency Management Strategy was a federal government initiative. And from that, there was money set aside for this NSERC network. And it's an S&T, a science and technology network. And it truly is a network. And I'll get into more details later, but the history is it came out of the blueprint for wildland fire science in Canada 2019 to 2029. Now, the blueprint identified 6 key areas. And this NSERC network, even though it's a substantial amount of people and funding, we couldn't address all 6. So the direction was to tackle 1, understanding fire in a changing world and climate change. This is close to where, my heart. Climate change is real, it's here, and it's not going to get better. And what we see around the world, I often say, the weather is wacky, just wait, it's going to get crazier, okay, unfortunately. Managing ecosystems, and you're quick on the draw there, Brian, and delivering innovative fire management solutions. So, practice informing science once again. So there's more detail if you want on the link provided there, and that's on the Canada Wildfire website. Next. So this NSERC funding came out of the emergency management strategy, and it was a large package of funding. $5 million was set aside for this network. It's a 5-year program, started in 2020. And we have researchers from across the country that the PIs include Laurie Daniels at UBC, Laura Chasmer at University of Lethbridge, Doug Wolford, University of Western Ontario. And I'm getting cat bombed, which happens when you work from home sometimes. Dave Martell, University of Toronto, Mike Waddington, if I missed you, I'm sorry because of the cat. McMaster University, Patrick James, University of Toronto, and I'm at University / Thompson Rivers University. It's a big gap, yes. So, and each of these individuals have teams of, researchers and numerous students. It's been very productive. We're reaching the midpoint. And where do we go from here? I'll have to say a little something about that in a few slides. The network themes that we addressed were wildfire danger, wildfire risk, novel data sources, fire and ecology, operational procedures, planning improvements. Who is the cat? Okay, that was direct message. Okay, Wildcat. Okay, next slide, please. Training the next generation. We have over 60 what we call highly qualified people in NSERC, highly trained people. These are students, postdocs, and they're really going to be the next generation of fire researchers, managers, practitioners, etc. And this shot is from an NSERC training course that was held just before Wildland Fire Canada last fall. And there was a number of students from the NSERC program and a few others. I think the number was close to 20. And we had help from practitioners like Dave Schroeder, Tanya Lecture, etc. And, this kind of learning, I think, is excellent stepping stone to a career in fire, whether it's fire research, fire management. Next slide, please. So here's just a few examples. There are probably about 45 projects underway under the whole Canada Wildfire / NSERC program. Fire growth modeling, and this is a Firecast trial started last year, where fire growth model for probabilistic fire growth modeling for every single ignition. And this was a partnership between Alberta, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Parks, Yukon, now BC. Extreme fire weather forecasting using machine learning. And this is done in cooperation with the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, AMI. I always have to think about the acronym. I want to say it's artificial intelligence or machine learning, but yeah, Alberta. Also, we're looking at ensemble medium range fire weather forecasting using numerical weather products. These are sophisticated models, 4 to 15 days with and without machine learning. A hot, dry, windy index and spread days in Alberta. And it's hot, dry, windy in Alberta and May seems to work quite well. And, you know, we're looking to see other locations like BC and other seasons. Drivers of nighttime burning in North America. You know, Bruce mentioned, you know, 2019 fires. There were some nights there where the fires were just running, you know, crown fires through the night. And we're starting to see more and more of these, and it's a real concern. Lightning activity studies in Alberta and BC, future wildfire risk in Banff, Kootenay, and Yoho National Parks. Many of these are led by students or postdocs, and yeah, there's a lot of work going on. Next slide, please. So partnerships, that has been, once again, a core foundation of what we now call abbreviatedly Canada Wildfire. Effective, durable governance. We have, you know, a structure and it's been working, but it's really about the partnerships and the, you know, the role that our partners play, whether it's the Canadian Forest Service, the University of Alberta, Alberta Fire, BC, Fire Management, Saskatchewan, All Hazard, but Fire Management, Northwest Territories. And, you know, to be honest, we're looking to expand, okay? Even stronger linkages to allied research communities, you know, FP Innovations, an obvious one, POP, CIFC, etc. Highly qualified personnel, highly trained people. That's also always been foundational to this organization. Next slide. So this is something that I just want to mention. Many of you may have heard about, you know, the federal government's National Adaptation Strategy. It's a very large program. I believe it's a 5-year program. But a particular note to the fire community is this thing about reduce $284 million to enhance community protection mitigation strategies. And in bold here, establishing a center of excellence for wildland fire innovations and resilience. And then there's in brackets, may be part of Wildfire Resistant Futures Initiative. I'd never heard of this Wildfire Resilient Futures Initiative. I provided the link there, but this is what I found when I did a search. And, you know, increase Canadians' resilience to wildfire, absolutely. Create a center of excellence for wildland fire in innovation and resilience to help transform wildfire management in Canada and internationally through innovation, knowledge exchange, and supporting Indigenous fire stewardship. I think Canada Wildfire addresses many of these things and could, in partnership, be that center of excellence. And maybe there would be multiple centers of excellences or a network or partnership, but I see Canada Wildfire playing a role here. And, you know, perhaps that's our way forward. And I leave that for you to check out. Is this my last slide, Brian? So, you know, that was a very quick overview. If you have questions, contact me directly. I can put it in the chat if you don't know. Most of you know me, but I'm at U of A/TRU. I'm emeritus at U of A now, and I am a research chair at Thompson Rivers University. I'll put both emails. I use both into the chat if you want to chat sometime. Okay, so thank you. And next slide, over to you, Brian.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Mike. Appreciate you walking through that. Always the challenge in these things is to get enough information so that we sort of pique your interest, but not so much that people are dozing off on the other side. So hopefully we're targeting that. I want to talk a little bit about governance, the way we actually have run Canada Wildfire. But before I actually jump right in there, I want to talk a little bit about one of the other exercises that came out of our strategic plan. was the whole idea, what are the things that we do and what are the kinds of things, if you like, that we support for other agencies to do? It's fairly clear that in Canada that there is some form of shared goals for all agencies, basically everybody with an interest in wildland fire, that we have a citizen, have citizens or have a country that's resilient and can live with vegetation fire, because there's not any question about whether there's going to be fires in the future. The question is, how are we going to accommodate them? And then the other side of that, I guess, is that we want to make sure that there's a resilient forest ecosystem, because we rely on it for a very broad range of activities. Certainly there's a lot of economic development and economic activities that go on in the forest, but there's a lot of value in the broader ecosystem and value for individuals in terms of spending time in the forest and actually having that as a place where we can visit, if you like. So the kinds of things that are in scope that we talk about sort of are going to fall under our vision and mission. And if you like, Canada Wildfire's work in that sense contributes to pathways that support societal transformation, societal and transformative change. However, it actually is a responsibility of other organizations to do some of those pieces. And so we've listed a number of them there. For example, the whole idea of public information, that transferring information to your average Canadian about fire risk, for example, is not really in scope of our particular projects. And we really are not in a position to make any policies where lives and livelihoods are protected from negative impacts of fire, for example. We can make advice, but we don't actually have the resources or a mandate, again, to do any kind of landscape management practices, particularly ones that would require legislation or significant funds. And we certainly want to make sure that the information is provided to agencies, but we're not in a position to feed that to others. There's other things, there's other organizations that manage this work and many other things, but this was an exercise that we found useful just to sort of walk through a little bit of the kinds of things we would clearly support. And sometimes people ask us questions, say, yes, sorry, that is not our lane, that's not our expertise. And that also goes into allied organizations that work with us. Canada Wildfire is basically set up into, if you like, three different organizations to some degree. And the first is the board of directors. And currently Canada Wildfire has what we call executive and management members. And so each agency that is an executive member contributes one member to a board of directors that oversees the operation. They are, if you like, a policy board. They aren't involved in the day-to-day operation, but we get them together for advice. We use them as a conduit to certainly the senior levels of government, and so they tend to be made up of senior managers. And we test the ideas with them, but the day-to-day operation comes from a management committee, and each member contributes 2 individuals to that particular committee. They basically meet regularly. We meet 6 times a year to sort of look at administrative and operational kinds of questions. And we also meet 6 times a year to talk about project kinds of ideas, things that people are doing, looking for opportunities to create discussion on common interests, common opportunities, common investments that people might be able to work on, as well as to be aware of interests that might only be, or investments rather, that might only be of interest to one particular agency, but it's nice to know what some of the others are doing. We have 2 directors in our current governance structure. There's Mike as the director of science, or the science director, and me as the managing director. And so we play a collaborative role and sort of exchange, but try and split up the duties a little bit. And then we have the good fortune of having a team of individuals that are hired to work for us. And that has been absolutely key. In the 2016, this is sort of the diagram that we came up to represent it. So we had the executive committee at the top, the management team basically made up of the agencies, as well as Mike and my position, basically looking after the operations. And then we had other individuals. We actually have 3 other individuals working for us right now. That's been very, very useful to have a team that can sort of tackle some of these projects. Okay, Buzz shows up again. We certainly have some ideas that we think would be very useful, would make us more effective, and would allow us to do some things that would have been very useful. And it's worth noting at this point that a lot of the activities that we do are sponsored by the agency. So each agency that's a member pays in an annual membership fee to be part of Canada Wildfire. But many of them are also in a position where they can say, we actually want to do some specific projects, and they give us a grant to actually pursue those. And so that money basically comes to us. We set up an agreement, and then we help them either conduct or coordinate the kind of research that would fall under that. Often that is an opportunity to fund students or to fund part of a student project. And there's been a good number of our graduate students who've received some funding to tackle some of the projects that are specifically requested by our member agencies. And I mean, in many ways, even the NSERC project, it's been sort of a 5-year commitment, which has been really good, but we've treated that as sort of a giant project or a giant group of projects that we are able to help coordinate and manage. And then some of the agencies have said, this is what's coming through NSERC. We like that. We're going to put some money in to support that. And so you actually leverage the existing money that's there. But what we're seeing as we go forward is that we still have the bulk of our agencies primarily represented in Western Canada. And so we have the good fortune under NSERC of having 4 projects that are run out of Ontario, but we need to reach further east with the actual fire agencies. And so we are looking for opportunities to have broader membership and participants that actually support us. And having more agencies that sort of give us an annual membership fee to keep the lights on allows us to do some things that we would love to do, but just don't have the resources. Canada Wildfire, and Bruce sort of hinted at this, was sort of set up at the University of Alberta. And I think it's fair to say that it was a pragmatic decision as much as anything. It created a place where we would have physical space. It created a place where there was already a financial structure, an HR structure to allow us to hire people, to allow us to engage students, to allow us to actually run research programs and fund them through the university. Over the time, as we've sort of evolved a little bit as an organization, and as some of the activities and various that sort of loom on the horizon, we are actually doing a bit of a review right now, saying, okay, do we actually, are we in the best position to realize our goals and our objectives sitting at an academic institution, or are there some other operating models that might work better? So that's a process that we hope to have done in the next 3 to 6 months. And even if we do decide to change or evolve to something different, that's going to be a longer process. It's going to take a little while to actually move there. We certainly see that there is a need for the kind of thing that Canada Wildfire does. We've got, I see 94 participants on what is fairly much a policy kinds of discussion here, but we've had regular participation and a large number of interest in the opportunity to present some of the seminars. We're seeing consistent interest from our partner agencies and saying, you know, we like what you're doing. Here's some ways to actually make it better. And we continue to have significant support for projects and research opportunities that we do together. And so we think that we need to make sure that we're well positioned to continue to do that and to meet those needs. And as Mike noted, we can't do this in a vacuum. We are basically working in the context of other programs. Certainly the federal adaptation strategy, as they're working out the details of that and figuring out what that looks like, we are actively thinking about how we might be engaged in that particular process in partnership or in support. But even internal to our own organization, we've actually really made an effort to also engage as regularly as we can with other organizations that aren't strictly speaking members, but who we think have common interests. And so we collaborate with them, offer opportunities for them to sit in on our courses, and really are looking for a way to engage as broadly as we can. The other thing that's worth noting, as many of you are aware, a number of the agencies have recognized the risk of wildfire and are saying we need to put some more money into either into a combination of actually addressing or being able to respond to wildfire, but also mitigating risk and also understanding what's going on so that we can actually make wise and strategic policy decisions. And then there is, of course, I think with the example that is being set in NSERC, there's going to be opportunities to use that as a foundation to pursue further academic research funding. And hopefully the partnerships that we're forming there, the discoveries that are being made are going to open up the doors to do that. So I think it may be a bit ambitious to think infinity and beyond, but certainly beyond is on our horizon, and we're looking for ways to move from the foundation that's been laid over the last 14 years and taking that forward into the next 20, 15, whatever. Thank you very much for attending today. That is sort of my last slide. I do want to sort of remind and make a note that we are active as much as we can be on both Twitter and Instagram at Canada Wildfire. And of course, our website is hosted at canadawildfire.org, and which has links to an awful lot of the other things that we do. And just to reinforce, we are able to exist because we're a partnership. Funding and support in terms of being part of the management committee and being able to provide us opportunities to do research. Sometimes it's actually providing access to places, rely on our partners, which is the government of Alberta, the government of Northwest Territories, and government of British Columbia. We have two agencies under the federal government with Canadian Forest Service, as well as Parks Canada. University of Alberta is noted here as sort of one of our partners, and Thompson Rivers is becoming one of our partners, but we sort of haven't signed on the dotted line yet. And then a Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency is also an active partner for us. And we also have a number of agencies that we do collaborate with sort of less formally. And we have a regular attendee from CIFC that sits in on our management committee meetings, as well as from FP Innovations, for example. So we're trying to build those linkages as well. And we're always open to other organizations that might be interested in saying, hey, we'd like to eavesdrop on this, or come for part of a meeting, or make a presentation to you. So also looking for that. So with that, I will basically say thank you again for attending.